Hi, Massimo.
Hi, Bob. Nice
How
seeing
you
you.
doing?
Good, good. Thank you. It's almost the end of the summer.
It is. Isn't that disturbing?
It really is, but
Because
we're
you're
just
an
gonna take.
academic, so the end of the summer is like it's very
Yeah, it's
gruesome.
going back to work.
Yeah. Whereas
Oh,
whereas you have just been what? What have you been doing?
working, but at my own pace and from home as opposed
Right.
to on campus.
And without having to grade papers, which is
That's right. Exactly.
so. Maybe I should introduce this. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Right Show. You're Massimo Pigliucci or something like that. Maybe you should pronounce it for good
Close.
measure. Is that close enough?
Pigliucci. The G is basically
Pigliucci.
silent. Yeah.
Pigliucci.
Yeah. There you go. Perfect.
So does that rhyme with Scaramucci? Yeah.
It actually does. Although we have
Congratulations.
nothing else in common.
Congratulations on that. It hadn't occurred to me. We are here because you wrote a book called How to Be a Stoic. I wrote a book. Yours came out a few months ago. Mine called Why Buddhism is True is coming out even as we speak. So we both stuck with simple, straightforward titles.
That's right.
I guess mine is a little more obnoxious than yours. I don't think yours is obnoxious at all, actually. How-to manual, that's not a pretentious thing,
I
right?
try not.
Have you gotten any blowback that, oh, aren't we special, explaining how to be a Stoic?
No, surprisingly, no. That's actually an interesting point because, as you know, for one thing, even though I don't know in your case, but in my case, the title of the book is actually the original one. It's the one that I proposed. But often that doesn't work out that way. That
Right.
the publishing house changes titles pretty much as they like. So
Well, I mean, they do books, unlike articles, but they generally seek the assent of the author, right?
right, they do. But the previous one that I had with the same publishing house, they changed the title without. I mean, they asked me, and I said
Good.
no, I don't want that, and they said okay, then we're not going to do it anyway. So.
They do have leverage.
Yeah, in the case of How to Be a Stoic, I think they didn't change the title or the subtitle, and no, I haven't gotten any negative review, any negative feedback on it. People seem to just jump straight into it, and so far, actually, lots of people find it useful. So
Yeah.
that's good.
Well, I have already gotten a certain amount of blowback, and I'm sure I deserve it, and it will continue. But just to amplify, just to broaden the invitation for people who want to give me trouble about this, I realized in looking at your stuff that I could have almost called my book "How to Be a Buddhist and a Stoic." Buddhism and Stoicism, their diagnosis of the problem is broadly similar.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, if you had called yours simply just How to Be a Buddhist, then we could have sold the two books as one package and be done with it.
That might have been a better idea, but it's too late. It's
Oh
come
well.
off the presses. So we did one of these conversations where I think we did establish, and we'll link to that, where we did establish that the two worldviews have a certain amount in common. And we talked a little bit about your advice column, where people actually write in, like as if you were Ann Landers or somebody,
That's right.
and ask for advice, how to handle really serious personal problems, sometimes, usually fairly significant, and you give them an answer from a Stoic point of view. It's become a very popular feature. And last time we talked, when we did a couple of these, we talked about them from both a Stoic and a Buddhist perspective. And so we thought we would, devote a whole conversation to that. Advice columning. What we're mainly going to do is take things from your column and talk about how you answered them. And then if I have something to add or interject, I can. From a Buddhist perspective, there's one of them is a specifically kind of it was addressed to me in a context of Buddhism, but maybe you'll have something to say about that as well.
Okay.
So
Right.
maybe should we start with like a one or two sentence summary of what the two worldviews have in common? I mean, I guess you could say like the way to deal with adversity is to deal with it. Like, don't try to run away from it. It's fair to say that at a superficial, practical level, they have that in common?
Well, they certainly have that in common, although one, I think, should be careful in immediately following up in both cases, because both Stoicism and Buddhism are often accused of being sort of quietist from that perspective. As you just take what it is and
Right.
you can't do anything about it. I don't think that's the case in either philosophy. The idea is that you focus on what you can control, and you let go the stuff that you cannot control. And of course, that requires some exercise in practical wisdom in figuring out what it is exactly that you can and you cannot control, right? Yeah. But yes, otherwise, I think they're both philosophies that have to do a lot with with practicing some kind of non-attachment to things and people, because everything is on the grounds that everything is impermanent. So you will have to let go of people and things at some point or another. That doesn't mean you shouldn't care about them. It just, in fact, on the contrary, it just means that you should be enjoying the things, at least in terms of Stoicism, enjoying the things you have while you have them, and the relations you have while you have them, but never complain when the universe sort of decides to take them back.
So the theme of impermanence is explicit in Stoicism because it's, of course, central in Buddhism.
Yes, it is. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus in particular, but even Seneca, are very, very clear about this thing. Epictetus uses an interesting metaphor. He says, don't wish to have figs out of season, because otherwise you'd be a fool. And, so he's talking about the fact that everything has a season, everything has a time. And if, your parents are going to die, and if you want them to be alive 10 years later or 20 years later, you're just hoping for a fig out of season. And probably you did not actually enjoy the fig, so to speak, while it was in season, because you thought that it was going to be there forever.
Okay. Well, maybe we should launch in the first one. Now you've got a copy of these two, I think, and in fact you've already answered for most of these. Is the one about regret. I'm struggling with the notion of regret. This is someone who had a surgery that didn't work out well. I guess it was elective surgery, and this person is blaming. I don't know if it's a he or a she, but blaming themselves. I can't get over that I did this to myself, they say. And what that is regret is tough, and I guess it's almost inherently associated with, not quite with blaming yourself, but the two tend to you can regret things that just happened to you, but I guess the most painful form of it is the kind where you blame yourself.
Yeah, which is the case in that we're talking about here. That person blame, although the decision was actually one that it was difficult, because basically half of his or her doctors told her to do it, and half of them said no. So at that point, it's just a flip of a coin. But yes, there is. You're right. Regret and sort of self-blame go together, which is why my answer was along sort of classical Stoic lines. First of all, Stoicism is a very forgiving and self-forgiving philosophy. Epictetus says that the beginning of wisdom is not to blame others, and the really wise person doesn't blame himself either. So you simply, there's no point in sort of self-flagellation. You make certain decisions because they seem to be the right ones at that time, and then that's it. Once the decision is made, there's no point in sort of going back over and over in circles in your head. Regret is definitely something that the Stoics try to get over, for the simple reason that it fails the basic test of the dichotomy of control. Right? Regret concerns things that are in the past. The past is by definition outside of your control, and so there's nothing you can do about it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't learn from it. Learning from your past mistakes it's a good thing. In fact, there are explicit Stoic exercises that help you to do that, like the evening philosophical diary, where you reflect on things you've done, and you also focus on the things you've done wrong. But regretting means that you indulge and you sort of waste emotional energy and time thinking over and over something that you can no longer change.
Yeah. And so the dichotomy of control is, I gather, the distinction between things you can and cannot control. By definition, everything in the past is something you can't control, whereas things in the future could fall into either category.
That's right. So the Stoicism has a little bit of a different attitude toward the future, because the future also technically right now it's outside of your control, but of course you can influence it. And so then the question, so for the Stoic, the best way to prepare for the future is to be mindful about what you're doing right now. Right. So really make sure that you're paying attention, making the best decisions at the moment, because your life is happening right now. And of course, the idea is that if you do make reasonably good decisions right now, then the future is going to be better than it would have been otherwise. But yeah, so technically the focus is on the here and now, but the attitude toward the past and the future, of course, is asymmetrical.
The it's funny in Buddhist circles, and I should say, I mean, there's all kinds of forms of Buddhism. It's been evolving and branching out for a long time. I've mainly been involved in kind of, Theravadan, Vipassana, mindfulness, in that order of generalness, tradition. But in that realm, it's funny, you hear a lot about not beating up on yourself. But I actually think that's largely a modern development. I don't run across that a lot in ancient texts, and in fact, I've come across parts, ancient scripture insisting that you be ashamed of yourself for certain kinds of failures, and this is the way spiritual traditions certainly are. I mean, the themes. In fact, a good example is that you can hear Christian pastors talking about living in the moment and being mindful, and they almost sound like they're modern Buddhist meditation teachers. So I think the emphasis on not beating up on yourself is as an explicit emphasis. It's kind of new. That said, the practice that you would employ to deal with the problem is pretty ancient, which is to say that you would sit with the feeling either of isolated regret, something you regret having done, or the broader feeling of self-loathing or and you try to develop a relationship with it that kind of disempowers it. I've talked about this irony before, that approaching negative emotions through mindfulness meditation by way of closer proximity, that is to say, being unafraid of the negative emotions, being willing to get closer to them in a sense and experience them more directly and continuously, can actually wind up, however ironically, giving you a kind of distance from them, a kind of, you could say detachment, non-attachment would be more technically accurate. So that's the basic practice, and in fact, this may become a kind of recurring refrain in our discussion because it applies to a lot of problems.
It applies across the board. One of the things that the Stoics do say, again in the ancient text, but it is something that is found also in therapeutic approaches that are inspired, at least in part, by Stoicism, such as rational emotive behavior therapy or cognitive behavior therapy. So one of the things they do is like, okay, you want to practice on smaller things that are easier to handle. So if you know that you have a tendency to regret things, don't start big. Don't start immediately with oh my gosh, I did an operation that caused a permanent disability. That's a pretty big thing, right? Start with small things. Just think about. For instance, use your philosophical diary or talk to somebody, because one of the things about in Stoicism is actually talking to peers. Sort of going through an analysis of your situation with other practitioners, and start with the small things. Start with things that you regret, but they're actually very little importance. Maybe I don't know. You bought something and then you regret. Having bought it because it wasn't really good or you didn't really need it or whatever it is. And start with that sort of stuff and see if you can deal with that sort of regret, and then little by little work your way up to things that are actually more impactful and they're actually more difficult to deal with. That is one, of course, the reasons why I keep saying to the people that write to my column that the theory isn't that difficult to understand. There's a few things here and there. I always try to back up my suggestions also with appropriate quotations from Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or Epictetus or whatever. But it's the practice that is the problem. So it's Stoicism, I'm sure, like Buddhism, is 5% maybe theory, and the rest of it is it's sweating over the practice. You have to do it every day and be mindful and go over it, and then say, okay, I'm not there yet, so let me go back and try again.
And I would say if there's a contrast, it's that I think Buddhism is a little more practice heavy, and Stoicism is a little more, I don't want to say philosophy heavy, because there are senses in which Buddhist philosophy is very well developed. There's a whole metaphysical explanation of why meditation will lead you to a clearer view of the world and of yourself, and so on. But in terms of the prescriptive part, Stoicism is a very well developed kind of self-help philosophy, and I think it's more thoroughly articulated in terms of kind of formal rationale and formal guidance.
I think you're right, but I think also that is the major distinction actually between the early Greek and the late Roman Stoics.
Okay.
We don't have, unfortunately, a lot of the writings. We only have fragments from the early Greek Stoics, but we do know that they were far more interested. I mean, they were interested in practice because it's always been a practical philosophy, but they also devoted a significant amount of time to the issues of metaphysics, logic, and a bunch of other stuff. Mm-hmm. The Roman Stoics, the ones that from whom we have the most writings, so not only the three that I keep mentioning, but also Musonius Rufus, for instance, who was Epictetus' teacher, they all shifted dramatically toward their practice. So of the three basic topoi that Stoics studied, physics, which were basically so the equivalent of natural science and metaphysics all put together, that was one topos. The second topos was logic, which also included what we would today call cognitive science and even rhetoric. Mm-hmm. And then the third topos was ethics, how to live your life.
Right.
That there was a major shift between the early and the late Stoa. The Roman Stoics, it's not like they abandoned the other two, but they really de-emphasized them in favor of the practice. And that's why you see a lot of, even the philosophy is directly addressing the practice.
Well, the Romans were very pragmatic people. They built they built the roads. They built the aqueducts, man.
Exactly.
Let's just get the job done.
Exactly.
Okay, I should add one thing is that there is a kind of meditation that's not technically mindfulness. It's called meta-meditation, loving-kindness meditation, that actually, on this question of self-loathing, it addresses the issue, but the funny thing is it almost treats it as the easy problem, because the goal of loving-kindness meditation is to get you to love even your enemies. So you do a series of things, and you start out, typically, thinking about yourself and loving yourself. And then I think in theory, you move on to harder and harder cases until you get to your enemy. But I always get hung up on myself. Like that is like an I'm sorry. That's where I get off the boat. And so I have not. Meta meditation has not done wonders for me so far. But so let's move on to another one. Let's see. This is somebody who stutters.
Yes.
Has a stuttering problem, but says the problem is not stuttering, but my anxiety.
Right.
Which I guess, I mean, of course, they're interrelated, right? I mean, I don't know how thoroughly we understand stuttering. I've always assumed that anxiety is at its root. But I don't know if he's saying that anxiety is at its root, or just that that the stuttering problem exists kind of exogenously or whichever, or endogenously, whichever one is right, and then knowing that either creates or deepens anxiety.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the way the writer puts it, he says that that he got the stuttering under control in certain conditions, under certain situations, but that when the situation is such that he has anxiety about, more anxiety about the outcome, then the stuttering gets worse. So it seems like he's saying that there are two separate problems and somehow interconnected. So the anxiety reinforces or makes worse the stuttering. So there, I told him a couple of things. So this person also sort of feels like a failure because he can't deal with the problem. And so my first reaction was, look, you're not a failure. You're actually trying your best. I mean, he actually has made progress on the stuttering. And so it's sort of, you should kind of flip it around and sort of pat himself on the back because he's doing better. One of the things that he probably should do at this point is more therapy. But unfortunately, that person at this particular point in his life cannot afford therapy. So I say, okay, then think about what is it that makes you anxious? What situations make you anxious? And A, can you avoid them? Or B, can you approach the same goal in a different way. So one of the things he wants to do is to go abroad, and that would for him would be a particularly stressful thing. Because of course it's speaking, being a different culture, possibly speaking a different language and that sort of stuff. So there, the advice is, well, why don't you again expose yourself, perhaps gradually to this situation, right? So instead of just jumping and moving across the ocean and say, okay, it's either it either goes or it doesn't. That's it. Why don't you try, maybe go into local community that sort of with different language and see if you can deal with that one, or maybe go for a visit for a short period of time before you actually entirely, dramatically change your life. But ultimately, I also tell him that, look, Stoicism, as well as Buddhism and a lot of other philosophies or religions, are obviously not therapies. They do require a certain amount of help from the outside, if in this case therapy, actual therapy. Right, so there are people who are specialize in these kind of things. You can't just say, well, I got these problem, let's say rooted in anxiety, and I start doing Stoicism and it's going to go away. I think the Stoicism is going to help because it's going to give you the right frame of mind that it's going to help the therapy work better. So I think of the two actually as mutually reinforcing, rather than say replacing standard therapy with a philosophical approach. After all, again, Stoicism is a philosophy of life. It's not really a therapy.
Right. Now, from the point of view of mindfulness meditation, what I'd say is, first of all, I warned you I might have a recurring prescription, which is kind of sit down and focus on the problem meditatively and develop a different relationship to the troublesome feeling or thought. But this one has kind of a twist on it, because with a lot of these things, you just, when the problem manifests itself, you sit down and meditate. You're feeling sad. You can meditate on the sadness. You're feeling anxious about a speech you're giving tomorrow, a talk you're giving tomorrow. You sit down and meditate. But in this case, if the problem actually shows up when he's actually about to talk to someone or talking to someone, you can't just sit down and meditate. The whole point is you got to talk to someone. So this is, the twist on this is that you practice by sitting down and imagining the situation, imagining that you're going to start talking to someone and you feel the anxiety well up. And I'm not really aware of, I've never known anyone who took this approach to stuttering, so I can't vouch for it. But in terms of analogs, like there are treatments of nicotine addiction via mindfulness meditation, and there you sit down and you imagine yourself. You imagine a cigarette. They may even show you a cigarette. Whatever serves to trigger the pattern of, in this case, just craving. And of course, this is really fundamental to Buddhism. The idea of craving. The term in ancient Pali is tanha, T-A-N-H-A. It is brought up in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's first sermon after his enlightenment. He says it is the problem. Now, actually, it turns out that one reason they can call it the problem is because they define it broadly. So it includes aversion. Because when you're averse to something, you kind of crave to be somewhere else, right? You crave, you want. Right. So it's basically just the desire for things to be different than they are. Whether it's a desire to be smoking a cigarette you're not smoking, or a desire to get away from some lion that's going to eat you and is too close, whatever. But anyway, with that as a footnote, this craving is a really fundamental problem, and they've actually done a guy named Judson Brewer when he was at Yale Medical School, where he no longer is, did a pretty big study. He and a bunch of collaborators of like 88 smokers, and they did this thing where they very systematically would just start thinking about having a cigarette. And not try to push the urge out of their mind. That's not the approach. It's to actually examine the urge, to sit with it, observe it, see what it feels like. Where in your body do you feel it? According to this study, this was actually more effective than the standard American Lung Association treatment, which basically involves group therapy and then a whole menu of options like nicotine patches or non-chemical therapy. But they claimed tremendous effect, and I would just say it's kind of like the stuttering problem in that you've got to kind of sit down and create a slightly artificial situation of pretend you're in the situation, pretend you're just about to light up the cigarette, or pretend you're about to talk to somebody.
Right. Yeah. In modern Stoicism, this is actually referred to as the ancient version is called a premeditatio malorum. Basically, sort of thinking about or bad stuff happening to you, and it's a kind of self-exposure to a stimulus under safe conditions, because you're just imagining the stimulus. You're not actually experiencing it. The modern version of Stoicism tend to do that as a visualization exercise. The ancient Stoics were more sort of about cognitively do things, so writing things down or talking to other people about that sort of stuff. The modern version has that, but it also has techniques that are then imported back from CBT, such as sort of visualization exercises. And so the premeditatio is precisely that you very slowly and deliberately imagine yourself being exposed to whatever it is that you dread, and you replay it over and over in your mind until you get accustomed to it, you get comfortable with it. And then usually the suggestion is to end the exercise by saying to yourself, if necessary, in a loud voice, well, was that all that I was afraid of? Or was that really what was bothering me? Or something like that. Some kind of repeating some reassuring phrase that says, well, that's really not that much of a big deal. Mm-hmm. And you're supposed to do it over and over. There is, as you were saying, empirical evidence that sort of stuff does help, but it does need to be done with care, because there are some people who do a premeditatio malorum on really emotionally impactful things, for instance, one's own death. Mm-hmm. And I would certainly recommend not to start there. Again, start small. Yeah. Don't engage. The first time you do a visualization exercise like that, don't think about your death. Think about your favorite cup breaking or something like that. Something much easier.
Yeah. There was just a piece in the New York Times, like, I don't know, today or something, about using virtual reality to do exposure therapy. Same basic idea. And it was, in a way, doing what you're saying, which is don't take the toughest case yet. But in this case, what it was somebody had developed a fear and aversion to a particular intersection of streets because of something that had happened there. And so rather than say, confront them with the actual streets, they took them there via Google Maps and virtual reality. So they know they're not quite there, but they're looking at the place and getting used to, and just getting used to it. So, there's maybe technology will save us.
No, you're right. So actually, that's an interesting point, because there are a number of other sort of meditation techniques or visualization techniques in modern Stoicism, such as the view from above, for instance, where you're supposed to, start looking at yourself from above, from close by, as if you were on a camera, and then sort of zoom back outside of your apartment, and then your city, and then zooming back out. And the idea is to provide you with a sense of proportion of things, of putting things into context, into a broader context, right? Now, this exercise is found in Marcus Aurelius, for instance, but it's a verbal exercise in that case. The modern version is a visualization exercise. Now, it turns out that I'm not particularly good at visualizing things. I get distracted easily if I close my eyes and I start visualizing that. I can do it, but it's difficult for me. So what did I do? I created a slideshow for myself using Google. Google Earth. I took pictures of my house from outside, my apartment from outside, and then zoomed back and back and back and back, and then it turned into a very helpful, in my mind, slideshow that I can look at it, and so I can visualize it because it's really literally in front of me, and I can think about it without being afraid of sort of being distracted or losing focus or something like that.
Yeah.
So technology can enhance that kind of meditation techniques. That's all I'm saying.
Now that has a little bit of a connection to the Buddhist concept of not self. There's no third person visualization exercise that I'm aware of. Although by now probably there is one somewhere in some strand of Buddhism. But there is the idea that identifying less closely than you habitually have with your own needs, desires, and concerns can be therapeutic. I'm also reminded of this this. I mean, of course, there's also the metaphysical doctrine. I mean, true Buddhists would say the not self doctrine has the added advantage of being true. They believe there's an important sense in which the self doesn't exist. But anyway, I saw this quote from Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, and this is a little related to the stuttering case, where part of the problem was what people are thinking of him. Right? It's like how you're being perceived as a stutterer. That's part of the horror. And Bezos was just talking about trying to not care what people think or say about you. And he said, go stand on a street corner and watch people walk by and ask yourself if any of them are thinking about you at that moment. And, you know, my mother used to say we wouldn't worry so much what people think of us if we realized how seldom they do. And that also, I think, has a little overlap with this visualization. You know, seeing yourself from a great distance, you realize you're just another person and you're not the center of the universe.
Now you were talking also in terms of anxiety. I just remember there's a bit in Epictetus that it's really nice because it has to do with anxiety, and it's also at the same time a good explanation of the dichotomy of control. He talks about a musician who is practicing on his own, and he's very confident because he's a good musician. You know, he's practicing and he's good. But then, and he has no worry when he's on his own. But then he goes on the stage, and all of a sudden he gets anxious. And he's afraid of not performing well. And Epictetus says, what's the difference between those two situations? It's the same musician with the same instrument and with the same ability.
Right.
But now he wants something, the second time, he wants something that is outside of his control, which is the approval of the audience.
Right.
If instead of doing that, he just concentrates on his own and he just closes his eyes and does his own thing as if the audience were actually not there, he'd be fine. And actually, that is something that a lot of modern musicians do, as a matter of fact. I know a few musicians, and that's what they tell me. They completely ignore the public. They just isolate themselves as much as it is possible so that, in fact, to eliminate the anxiety or reduce the anxiety of the performance and just focus on the music, on what they know that they're doing. They know how to do it because they are good musicians. But as soon as you start thinking about, well, how do I come across, that's where the anxiety starts because that's not under your control.
Right. Well, easier said than done, I'd say, to get up in front of a bunch of people and not think about what they're thinking of you. But I congratulate everyone who achieves it. So then there's a question of about attention deficit disorder.
Yes.
Right. There's somebody who suffers from it, and I exhibit all the signs of adult ADD. He or she lacks the hyperactivity, which gives them something in common with me. Not good at focusing, although and they're not hyperactive. So what did you have? What did you have to say here?
Well, the first thing I had to say, this is an even more clear case, let's say, as compared to the one for the stuttering. This is an even more clear case of the difference between a therapy and a philosophy, right? And that's not to say that, again, the philosophy is not going to be helpful. But it is going to be helpful in tandem with some kind of therapy. So if you suffer from this, I don't want to get into, of course, I mean, I'm going to bracket completely any discussion about the reality of ADD and the DSM-based diagnosis and all that sort of stuff. Let's leave that to the specialists that discuss that kind of stuff. But let's assume that there is, in fact, such a condition. People suffer from it. And let's assume that that condition is, in fact, got something to do with the status of your brain, and it can be affected by medication. That being the case, then I go back. In fact, in that column, I mentioned a colleague of mine, Lou Marinoff, who wrote this book years ago called Plato, Not Prozac, about philosophical counseling. And despite the provocative title, and the book is provocative because Lou is a provocative kind of person, but in fact, even Lou, right at the beginning of the book, in the introduction, says, look, sometimes you really do need Prozac first, or whatever medication it is, because your brain is not in a situation, in a position that you can actually think straight. And if that's the case, and there is medication and or medical therapy that is available, you should definitely do it, because the philosophy isn't going to do it for you. But then, of course, he says, but once your brain is back to a sort of a more or less normal range of functionality, then you still have your day-to-day problems to deal with. You still have to have your priorities straight, your relationships, your work, your et cetera, and that's where the philosophy comes in more prominent, because Prozac, of course, is not going to give you an answer to those questions. So in the case of the ADD, it's a little more complicated because I think actually there is evidence at least anecdotal evidence from other people in the Stoic community that suffer from similar kind of mental conditions, that the Stoic practice, the mindfulness, do help directly with the ADD, and they do so even better if they're actually coupled with therapy. So this is similar to the anxiety issue. This is similar. So my recommendation, every time that I hear that I'm faced with somebody suffering from an actual mental condition, is, okay, ask yourself, one of two, remind yourself of one of two possible situations. First of all, if the condition is in fact a diagnosable condition, you should go and engage in therapy, and then couple that with the Stoicism. The Stoicism is going to help you stick with the therapy, and the therapy is going to bring you back to a situation where you can actually benefit from the Stoicism, from the Stoic practice. But the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that people often say to me, "Oh, but Stoicism can't do anything about, I don't know, seriously deep depression or extreme positions on the spectrum and that sort of stuff." And my answer there is like, well, no philosophy or religion can do anything at that point. I mean, yes, we are assuming that there is a more or less functional mind, right, in the subject, that it's actually operating. It's the same thing when you go to the gym, right? So if I go to the gym and I want to improve my muscles or my aerobic capacity or whatever it is, I can do that. In fact, lots of people with very different initial conditions can do that. But at some point, if I actually start, I lost my limbs, then there is no point in asking, can I improve my muscles? Or say, no, I can't, because I don't have them anymore. Right. So, or if I'm paralyzed or something like that. So there has to be a minimum functionality before we can start talking about, practicing a philosophy, I think. Okay. But once if that functionality is there or is still there, then I think that the practice actually is very helpful, especially coupled with therapy.
Yeah, okay. So on attention deficit disorder, I mean, I really do kind of have it. I actually got diagnosed with it once, for what that's worth. At the same time, I'm not really taking a position on the reality of it as a disease or a pathology. My own view is it's probably a little more like a spectrum, and the further along you are, the more problematic it is. And it's always been pretty problematic for me. I mean, I'm a very slow, distractible reader. In college, I never, ever emerged from a lecture with anything like coherent notes, and I really tried. I mean, I would sit down and try, and I just couldn't, because it was always either too boring to pay attention to or so interesting that it made me think of other, ramifications, right? So, anyway.
Yeah, but, I know students like that, absolutely.
Yeah, so but one thing I've noticed, and I think partly with the help of meditation, and then this was kind of confirmed by a teacher on a 2-week retreat I did 2 summers ago, I guess. And it's that, and this is very kind of Buddhist, and it's also very consistent with modern psychology, which is that attention deficit, at least as it manifests itself within the, most common ranges. I mean, there may be these extreme cases that have a whole different origin, but as the problem of trying to pay attention manifests itself to in people like me, it is an affective problem. It's a problem with your feelings. If you pay attention, like you're trying to get some work done, and you run into this kind of difficult place where you don't know what to do, and it pops into your mind that you really need to research smartphones. You need to buy a smartphone. Well, 2 things. Continuing to work started feeling bad, and an alternative that feels good, that almost just literally pulls you away with the feeling, pulls your attention away with the feeling, that shows up. So, and again, this is something that, it's hard to directly, when you're working, you can't be meditating at the same time, but at the same time, in my experience, mindfulness meditation makes you more aware in the first place that that's the problem. Because it makes you more conscious of your feelings, you're more likely to notice, wait, at this moment, I've got an affective problem. This is a yearning. I feel it. I feel the yearning. And that in turn can make it easier to just stop and say, well, observe the yearning until it goes away, and then look back at your work.
Yeah,
So
you're right. So I haven't been diagnosed, but I think I do have a mild version of what you're talking about. And since I started practicing Stoicism, I noticed that one thing happened, which is when I do get that yearning, that feeling of, I'm losing interest in what I'm doing now, even though I should be keep doing it. And I get distracted and I want to do something else. I want to go and check my email, or I'm going to go and, go on Facebook or whatever it is. Since I started, before starting practicing, I would just do it. I would just stop and go back, and then that will waste time, because not just the time that you spend on email, which isn't necessarily that long. It's then the time to refocus back to what you were doing. That was the major problem. Once that I started practicing what Stoics call mindfulness, which is literally sort of the pay attention to the here and now, to try to focus on what it is that you're doing, as if that, trying to get into a situation that some modern psychologists call flow, right? Mm-hmm. So the getting lost into what you're doing. Once I started practicing that, then I noticed something very similar to what you just described happened to me. That is, I started noticing that, here it comes, is this feeling that I now want to go somewhere else. And almost, by itself, what happened was that I observed it and I said, oh, come on, you can actually do better than that. You can go back. And then gently pull. I didn't really resist it. It's hard to explain, but it's not really resistance. It's not like a forcing myself. It's more like, okay, let it go gently and then go back naturally to what you were doing.
And if you have to sit there and observe it longer before you can get away from it, that's fine. In other words, just look at it, feel it, and it often will weaken of its own accord.
That's right.
And that's a good habit. That itself is a positive pattern to get into. So, yeah, I mean, and here's something that has nothing to do with Buddhism. Another trick that sometimes works for me is like, I usually have more than one piece of writing I'm working on. So just open up all three, and then when you don't want to confront one, the other one will start looking relatively attractive.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. During any given week, I usually open up at least 3 different projects, and then I alternate. Whenever I get too tired or I run out of ideas or whatever it is on one, then I go to the other. What that does, it seems like it's distracting, but in fact, since they're all projects that I want to do and they're and I need to do because it's for work and all that, these are not waste of time. This is I just switch my attention from one to the other, but I keep pushing all 2 or 3 simultaneously, and by the end of the week, I'm much more productive actually than it would have been otherwise. Yeah.
Right. So then this is the last of the ones in from your column, and then we have one more after this. But this is somebody who is a doctor working, and brings up the whole the problem of you're faced with a lot of like traumatic situations and so on, and preserving your, not getting emotionally dragged down into it, and yet preserving your compassion. So he says, I wondered what a Stoic conception of resilience might look like, again, if it is a he, and how the Stoics might advise a doctor looking to be more resilient. I do worry, however, that in asking doctors to be more resilient, there might be a conflict with other duties of care or of professional virtues like compassion.
Yeah, and that is an excellent question, because, of course, Stoics are often accused, and I take it that the similar objection is sometimes at least a level at Buddhism.
That's right.
But they're often accused of sort of engaging in an emotional detachment and sort of being like a Mr. Spock kind of person, right? In fact, the very word non-attachment or detachment from things, that sort of seems to indicate, so you don't care. You're training yourself about not caring. And I think there is a very interesting, very important difference between, of course, sympathy and empathy, for one thing. That is, either one is the ability to understand that the other person is suffering and to sort of, relate to that suffering at a sort of a more general level. The other one is actually being emotionally involved yourself. And the Stoics are very clear about what to do in this situation. You should definitely sympathize, whatever word you want to use, actually, because recently there has been some confusion between the actual meaning of sympathy and empathy. So let's leave them aside for now. But yes, you definitely want to obviously practice compassion with the other person, be compassionate for the other person. I mean, the Stoics refer to their philosophy often as a philosophy of love. But at the same time, you don't want to be internally disturbed as much as possible, because your own practice is part of your own practice is this idea that in fact everything other than virtue is a preferred indifferent. It's something that it's okay to go after so long as it doesn't impair your moral integrity. So the idea, so in answer to that particular question from that reader, I actually bring up the example of a good friend of mine who is, as far as I know, not a practicing Stoic, but she's certainly somebody that I think of as a natural Stoic. And she, for more than 10 years, she doesn't do it anymore, but for more than 10 years worked in the field with a disaster relief organization under really, really difficult conditions. I mean, this is horrible stuff. She's seen horrible stuff over the course of 10 years. And I asked her precisely that question, so how do you deal with that sort of stuff? I know she's a very compassionate person. I know her very well. So it's like, but don't you get emotionally and to the point of being paralyzed by these things? And her response was, no, we practice pretty much what doctors in the ER practice. This idea that, yes, you want to be caring and attentive to the person, but you also want to practice a certain level of detachment, because if you let yourself get involved emotionally too closely, then not only you're not going to be able to do it for long, but you're also probably not going to be able to help actually the other person. Mm-hmm. The Stoics are very clear about this. Both Seneca and Epictetus, for instance, say that not only you should be compassionate outwardly and be careful, be caring for other people, but also at the same time be careful not to be involved too much internally. But they also say, externally, do whatever it takes to be helpful for that person. So if in fact that person needs a show of emotion, something that normally wouldn't even come to you, do it. Go right ahead. Be helpful in whatever manner it's helpful to that person. This is not about you; it's about them. Mm-hmm. So try to do within your power whatever it is that is helpful to them. But at the same time, the sort of the converse of that, the symmetrical aspect of that is, don't let their emotional distraught being sort of contagious to you. You want to always keep in mind that the reasonable way to go through life is to accept certain things for what they are. And so if there is, if somebody lost, one of the examples was Seneca was trying to make one of her friends feel better about having lost her son. And Seneca says, I cry with you. I am with you on this. But at the same time, he also sort of talks to his audience and says, but at the same time, internally, I keep reminding myself that, these things do happen and we have no control over them. And to sort of beat yourself up emotionally for it is absolutely useless. And in fact, it's worse, because then you get into a situation of where you might indulge your own, bad feelings and get yourself paralyzed by them, and sort of get into a spiral that can easily, actually, we would say today, lead to depression.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, first, you're right. Buddhism does get accused of something in this realm, and the idea is that, well, if you disempower emotions and feelings sufficiently, don't you quit caring about other people, or in the extreme case, caring about anything. I mean, there's a kind of an accusation of nihilism right. that you sometimes come across, and it's an interesting challenge and one worth taking seriously. But leaving the nihilism question aside and just the question of caring for other people, I mean, first of all, as a matter of doctrine, Buddhism puts a lot of emphasis on selflessness, on compassion. At the same time, I think it's true that meditation tends to well, first of all, there is an actual kind of this loving kindness meditation that I referred to, which cultivates compassion toward other people. But that aside, just in my experience, garden variety mindfulness meditation, I suppose it does give me, and here I'm thinking about like how I feel at the end of a 1-week retreat or something as being the most kind of extreme example, kind of what it would be like to meditate all the time every day. It does lead me less kind of to be less kind of emotionally involved with things in a certain sense. At the same time, I have a deepened appreciation of beauty, and I think I have a genuinely more compassionate view toward other people, and because I am less self-absorbed. Now, that's not the same as saying that I am more empathic in the sense of just literally feeling their pain in a way that, beyond a certain point can actually be crippling. It is a concern for well-being that doesn't have the same degree of emotional involvement as kind of empathy is classically understood. And, interestingly, Paul Bloom, a friend of mine, psychologist at Yale, wrote a book called Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion. And if I'm recalling the book correctly, he said he was pleased to discover that there actually is this distinction in Buddhism, and they had actually gotten adept meditators to try the two exercises, first feel empathy, then just feel compassion, as like mental exercises. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think there was actually a difference in brain scan, right? I mean, and there was the report that the compassion is much less draining than the empathy. So you are much better equipped to deal with things. Last thing I'd say is there's this guy, Daniel Ingram, who's a well-known meditation teacher who purports to have attained enlightenment. I'll leave that question to him and others. I'm agnostic on the whole question of enlightenment, but he certainly is a very accomplished meditator, and he is an emergency room physician. And
interesting.
And I think he will definitely tell you that his frame of mind as a very serious Buddhist meditator or someone who used meditation to get to this the state of mind he's in, that is a real asset.
Yeah. So a couple of things. This sounds a lot like Stoicism, actually. It's basically what you said is, I could have said it quoting Epictetus, but it's the same. It's actually the same thing. The Stoics did use the word sympathy. Sympathikos is Greek. It comes from the early Greek. On the other hand, empathy, as I discovered recently, precisely while I was reading an article by Bloom, actually, on that book that you mentioned. Empathy is actually a fairly recent introduction into the English vocabulary. It's like late 1800s. And there's a colleague of mine at CUNY who is a philosopher, Jesse Prince, who has come up independently with very similar conclusions, sort of against empathy, quote unquote. Now, to some extent, you cannot eliminate empathy because it's a natural human reaction, and in fact, you probably wouldn't want to. But what the idea is precisely what you were saying a minute ago. That is, empathy can be draining. You cannot sustain empathy for forever and for at the level that it would be required. I mean, if you let's say think about a large catastrophe, 10,000 people died in a flood or something like that, you cannot empathize for 10,000 people who died on the other side of the world. You simply can't. It's just not a human thing to do. On the other hand, you can sympathize. You can concern yourself. You can feel compassion for it. You can try to act reasonably in a way that is as helpful as possible. So I completely agree that in this case, Stoicism and Buddhism really do converge very significantly, and modern psychology and some modern philosophy provide us with pretty good backup points for this attitude.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move now to our final question. This is one that came to me via email. It's actually, I guess, kind of a celebrity question because it comes from a very well-known author, Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet about being an introvert. And I personally think I qualify, so I really enjoyed the book. And in fact, we had a conversation with her on this website some time ago. And I think the subtitle is something like The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking or something. She's since written a bunch of other stuff. This was like a mega best-selling book. She's since written other stuff on the subject. And I think it's kind of built a community of people. It's a case where there were all these people out there who weren't necessarily in contact with one another. And I think her book has helped them get into contact. Anyway, she has a question that's not particularly related to introverts. It's related to a much broader category of people, which is at least once you reach, I would say, middle age. It's a very broad category of people. People who wake up in the middle of the night with anxiety and can't get back to sleep. I count myself not proudly among their numbers, but it's an issue for a lot of us, and Susan writes, like you, I am prone to middle of the night anxiety about whatever is worrying me at the moment. So I could learn to meditate my way through it, but I find that listening to compelling podcasts almost always takes my mind off whatever it is, and most of the time helps me to fall right back to sleep. So is there any reason to try meditating instead? It feels like that would somehow be more pure, but that's nonsense, right? I think the short answer is, yeah, that's nonsense. I mean, I want to say a little more about this, but I do want to say that if you've got a problem like this and you've got something that works, you're done. You are done. This is a really horrible problem that you know, and it is correlated with age. It doesn't get better. But what I would say, I guess, beyond that is a couple of things. I mean, I would use it to make a distinction about two different ways meditation can work. Okay? I mean, she just found something to distract her from the problem rather than, you might say, confronting the problem.
Yeah.
And that's actually, there are actually two different strands of meditation that correspond to those two options. You know, typically in mindfulness meditation, you start by focusing on your breath, and that is a way to calm your mind, to get your mind to quit wandering. And then once you've done that, you can kind of give true focus to anything. It could be a sound you're listening to, it could be a sensation in your body, or it could be an emotion like anxiety. So the classic mindfulness meditation would be focus on your breathing, then focus on the anxiety. But sometimes the breathing itself works just as distraction. So in other words, you don't get to the point of dealing with the emotion. And if you don't have to, that you can quit there so far as I'm concerned. Now, I would say that I guess a virtue of meditating on the anxiety is that in principle it's good practice. In principle, you should get better and better at it. And then you've got this technique that works. On the other hand, again, if you've got the podcast, you won't need this. I mean, maybe there would be some payoffs in terms of everyday anxiety. I don't know. But, you know, I guess the case for doing it is meditate. There's a reason they call it the practice. It's you practice, and in principle, you get better. Last thing I'd say about this is there's a little trick I play to calm myself down. If I do this, if I'm up with anxiety and I'm like meditating on it, and by the way, I usually do this lying down. Some people actually get up and sit up in bed, and I've done that, but I'm usually lying down. And the trick is this. Okay, so I have a morning meditation practice, and when I'm awake with anxiety, one of the concerns is that if you don't get to sleep, you know, you won't be able to do work tomorrow or you know, whatever. I mean, part of it becomes this kind of cyclical logic. And so one thing I say to myself is, okay, look, I normally meditate for half an hour in the morning. If I lie here and do this for half an hour, I'll just call that the day's practice. And if it takes that long, that won't be lost time, because I just won't meditate in the morning. So that's like a little trick I use to make myself a little less apprehensive about the prospect of not getting to sleep. But the short answer is, if it works, do it.
Yeah. No, I agree. So a couple of comments from the Stoic perspective, I guess. One is it's interesting that you keep using the word trick, or mind trick. And sometimes sort of some of the critics of Stoicism say, oh, but this is just a mind trick. And my response to that is, everything is a mind trick. The way we perceive the world is a mind trick.
Well, I think we agreed on this last time we spoke.
Exactly.
And this is, it's important. I mean, in Buddhism, this is like hardcore doctrine you're talking about. The idea of the self is an illusion. The idea that the objects and people in the world have what they call inherent existence, meaning, well, we'll get into that later. But the point is, I mean, we won't get into it later in this conversation, but I get into it in the book. But the point is, the idea is that you are constructing your perceptual world all the time. You attach narratives to it that are not objectively true. And so yeah, it's a mind trick. Don't apologize for playing mind tricks. There's no,
Exactly. Now that is what it is. I mean, Stoicism is about reorienting your narrative. You're changing your perspective on things. That's the basic idea. In terms of the specific case you're talking about, first of all, I agree with you. If she found something that works, stick with it. That's fine. You don't have to raise any other issues. But what a Stoic would do, I guess, would also make a mental note and then get up the following morning once the anxiety is sort of subsided and you're doing something else, and think it over and ask yourself, maybe as part of your daily journaling, daily diary, say, well, why exactly was I anxious? And because they are the answer. Sometimes anxiety does have good reasons. It's a hint to something that you should in fact be worried about, but then with a more calm mind you can say, oh, okay, that was it, so can I do something about this? Does it fall under the dichotomy of control or what? Or you discover that no, that was an entirely irrational sensation and just went away with the little trick of listening to something else. The few times that something like that has happened to me, I usually get up and start reading a book that I like. And it does the same thing. I get absorbed in the book, and then I fall asleep, and that's fine. But again, you do want to be mindful about sort of listen to your own emotional reactions, because they might be telling you something. And so one of the fundamental Stoic doctrines from Epictetus is this idea that you take what he calls an impression, that is your first reaction to something, and you inquire. And you say, well, you're just an impression, but now let me look at you more closely and see what exactly you are. Maybe you're nothing. Maybe you're just a figment of my imagination. You need to go away. Or sometimes you actually are something that I need to be taken care of, but on a more rational, reasonable basis.
Yeah. No, it can happen that things you're anxious about are things it's fruitful to think about and figure out a solution to. On the other hand, very often happens with this kind of nighttime anxiety. You wake up in the morning and go, I just can't believe I thought that was a big problem.
Right.
Right. Well, listen, Massimo, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. That was fun.
Everyone should buy your book, How to Be a Stoic. Especially.
And yours is coming out when, you said?
Oh, any moment now. I mean, we're taping this, July 31st, and it's out August 8th. So. Right. Might as well be out. That's Why Buddhism is True. There should be some kind of discount for buying both of them at Amazon, I think.
If enough people start buying both of them simultaneously, then that's probably going to happen.
Well, plus I gave Jeff Bezos a plug earlier, so
that's
I'm sure he will reciprocate.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Massimo. Maybe we'll keep up your advice column again. I mean, if you Google How to Be a Stoic, you won't just get the book; you'll get your whole website, which includes a weekly advice column and other resources. And people should check it out. And maybe down the road, when you've given a whole bunch more advice, we'll check back in and compare notes. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care.